Hmm. Oh heck, let's just make a Duston deck. Dustons are one of the numerous archetypes that started as an interesting concept, but their execution was rather pathetic. There is a lot of potential in the idea of mass summoning a number of weak monsters that can clog up your opponent's field because they can't be utilized as building blocks for combination plays, tribute, synchro, or XZ summons, that later produce negative effects when they're removed from the field. However, when actually reading the effects of these Duston monsters, the negative potential is incredibly lacking. Basically, you cannot count on the effects produced by destroying Dustons to amount to any real meaningful advantage. Therefore, the chief strategy when playing Dustons is to use them to clog your opponent's field, limiting their play options, and basically just stall until you can produce the appropriate resources to launch a OTK-esque attack. When looking at the direct Duston monsters and its associated support, as previously stated, one is not immediately impressed. White Duston is kind of worthless. I don't really understand why people run this card because I've seen a fair amount of Duston decks where White Duston is run, and I don't really understand that. It doesn't appear to do anything of value for an effective Duston deck. Yellow Duston has a fair effect, but it would be much more interesting if the owner, i.e. Dustons, got to select the returned monster, not the controller. With the ability of the controller to select the monster, the negative effect is rather irrelevant and actually may turn out to be even a positive. However, the strength of Dustons is their field clogging effects. So, with like all of the other colored Dustons beyond white, I run 2 copies because 1 copy is too little and 3 copies is too cloggy, and there are other elements that must be added to the deck to support the overall strategy. Blue Duston's effect is rather worthless. If it removed the card for a full turn, then it could actually be helpful, but it's not the case. Maybe there's a very incredibly small probability that you hit a hand trap, but even then, again, I run 2 copies for combo purposes only. Green Duston can actually be a detriment to the Duston player because the opponent can bounce back dead cards on the field to use again, like Call of the Haunted or Fiendish Chain, but again, 2 copies for combo purposes. Red Duston is the only Duston that actually has a meaningful negative effect with the 500 burn damage. The effect is not good, but at least it's meaningfully negative. 2 copies. As the critical element to the entire strategy of the Duston deck, one must run 3 copies of House Duston. There isn't much to say about House other than getting it on the field as soon as possible is critical. To that end, I run 3 copies of Shining Angel and 3 copies of Stygian Security because House is a light level 1 fiend. Remember, the combo is the most important thing, so do not be afraid of suiciding either a Shining Angel or a Security into an opponent's monster, then search for House, and then smash House into that very same monster to make your play. Yeah, it's going to cost you life points, but if a Duston deck can't hit its combo, then its probability of victory pretty much plummets. On its face, Star Duston seems like an interesting card, until one realizes that it is basically worthless. The chief problem with Star Duston is that it is simply inferior to Goblin King. The summoning condition is incredibly annoying, making it a dead draw a decent amount of the time, if not a simple 1000 attack point monster that's going to get run over by a wide variety of normal summoned monsters, another good percentage of the time. While the ability to prevent your opponent from special summoning, the problem is that Star cannot effectively do damage on its own because of the monster control restriction. It kills itself before it can attack directly, and the way this deck is designed for maximum winning probability, the deck can't swarm very effectively outside of the combo to take advantage of Duston's effect. If Star had Piercing, then it would be fantastic in this deck and a 100% staple. But alas, it doesn't. It's one of those rare cases where Piercing is actually good, in my opinion. Magicalized Duston is just a It's just horrible in general, but it's also horrible in a Duston deck. It can be somewhat useful as an interesting side deck card in very specific combo builds, but in a Duston deck, this card is just worthless. The searching effect is marred by the lack of an important Duston monster. As stated before, I think Star Duston is needless, and it's searchable via a lot easier and more versatile cards than Magicalized Duston. And the rest of the Dustons are pretty much worthless in hand. So the moral of the story, this card is very bad for a Duston deck, and pretty bad overall. Apparently, Magicalized Duston wasn't enough, and there needed to be a quasi-clone in trap form, so go back about a minute, and yeah, that's why you should not run Duston Roller either. As mentioned above, Goblin King is the beater of this deck, so I run 3 copies. Goblin King will commonly have 4 to 8,000 attack points when you summon it outside of a desperate summons, because you're going to be summoning it after you've hit your big combo. Duston decks are basically a 2-step process. Step 1, trigger House Duston. Step 2, summon Goblin King. Of course, there might be a decent amount of time between Step 1 and Step 2. Finally, another card I don't see a lot of in Duston decks, which is a choice that confuses me a little, is 1 copy of Blackluster Soldier. This deck runs 6 darks, 6 lights when not counting Blackluster itself, so its summons is very probable, and it gives you a nice secondary means of actually doing some damage. Moving on to the spells, first I run only one of my typical 3 staples in Raigeki. Book of Moon is alright, but it doesn't play a meaningful role in triggering the combo, and this deck doesn't have the monsters to really fight back on normal grounds to take advantage of Book of Moon's combo stopping ability, so it becomes of less value in that context, and there really should be no need to explain for the lack of soul charge in this deck. Obviously, due to the importance of King and House in this deck, I run the 1 allowable copy of 1 for 1. Due to the poor statistics of Duston monsters in King when numerous fiends are not available, i.e. you haven't hit the combination, 3 copies of Creature Swap work well at turning the table somewhat on your opponent, especially if they sit on 1 monster. Speed is important in this deck, so I run 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. Why Upstart over Pot of Duality? Obviously, the point is getting the field full of Dustons as fast as possible, and Pot's special summoning restriction eliminates same turn suiciding if you pick up a house or an angel or a security. The extra life points from Upstart may reduce the probability of OTKs, but if you get the lock on the opponent, he or she's going to be in significant trouble, which reduces the necessity of the OTK. Obviously, protecting King and to a lesser extent Blackluster Soldier is important to ensure that they can do their damage, because there's almost nothing really worse for this deck when you hit your combo, you slap down King, and your opponent turns over Ring of Destruction, or your opponent turns over Fiendish Chain. So I run 3 copies of Forbidden Lance, as the 800 drop-off is somewhat meaningless when King's going to be walking around with 7,000, 8,000 attack points, and Blackluster can banish on that given turn, and then go to attacking next turn. I also run 2 copies of Enemy Controller to switch Dustons on my opponent's field to attack mode, or do some temporary monster swapping if need be. Finally, I run 2 copies of Moon Mirror Shield to turn a stray Duston into a Battle Wrecking Ball. United We Stand is also an option, but I like Moon Mirror Shield better because United We Stand in this deck is somewhat of a home run card. It only really works effectively after you've hit your combo, and if you've hit your combo, you're not going to run into a huge number of problems against most decks, so United We Stand loses its usefulness in a lot of respects. One card that I don't run that some people might wonder about is Where Art Thou? I don't run this card because you need to control a level 1 monster to activate it, which normally will involve giving up your normal summons, which produces inefficiency. Where Art Thou can speed up the deck a little, but as I mentioned, in my experience, once you hit the combo and your opponent's got 3-4 Dustons on their field, they'll have trouble doing a lot of damage over a short period of time, so the additional speed is not critical relative to some of the efficiency you're going to be losing by running the card. For the traps, I run 2 of my 3 key staples and 1 Torrential and 1 Bottomless. No Solemn Warning for this deck because, as I've alluded to, there will be a number of times when you're smashing a Angel or a Security into a monster, then you're following that up by smashing a House into that monster, and that's going to cost you some significant life points. Finally, because activating the combo is essential to winning, 2 copies of Ceasefire is recommended because it's commonly going to net you 3,500 to 4,500 damage, taking some of that weight off King to try to do 7,000 plus damage by itself. While Just Desserts is another possible option, for me, I just don't think it does enough damage with a maximum of 2,500 to really be valuable to run it in those times where you won't have 4 or 5 monsters on your opponent's field to do major damage. Ceasefire, it can be somewhat useless too, but it's got that 3,500, 5,000 damage potential number that significantly dwarfs Just Dessert's number. I've seen Duston decks in the past not run extra decks because people have said, well, you can't do anything with the Dustons, it's kind of pointless. I don't understand that position, for this deck does run level 1 monsters that can be utilized in XZ summoning. It runs a tuner, and it runs a small number of level 4 monsters. So if you can afford it, it makes sense to run some form of extra deck. My extra deck is as followed. I run 1 Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. It's not easy to summon, but it's still possible, and if you got one, you might as well throw it in there, because if you hit it, it's always helpful. I run 1 Hi-Speedroid Chanbara. Closing up the sinkers, I run 1 Mistbird Clausolas. I run 1 101, 1 Castel, 1 XZ Dragon. Now getting into kind of the ones in their appropriate rank ups, I run 2 Downerd Magicians. Again, this is one of those rare decks where piercing can actually be useful. 1 Ghostrick Angel of Mischief, 2 Ghostrick Dullahans, 1 number 54 Lionheart for some, I'm going to slam myself into your high attack point monster, we'll both take the damage, or you just take the damage. 2 Slacker Magicians, and 1 Sylvan Princessprite. Overall, the general strategy behind Dustons is to pull off the summoning combination early in the duel by turn 1 or 2, when your opponent only has 1 monster on the field. When this combination occurs, you should summon the 2 remaining copies of House Duston to your side of the field, along with 2 other Dustons. Usually I summon green and blue, but it really doesn't matter as long as you try to avoid red because of that 500 damage. And then you want to summon 1 copy of each color, red, green, yellow, blue, to your opponent's side of the field in face-up attack mode. House Dustons do not have restrictions on XZ summoning, so typically the play should either be XZ into Slacker Magician or Dullahan, and when appropriate, level up into the appropriate rank 4 associated monster. For Slacker Magician, it's going to be Downerd Magician, and Dullahan, it's typically going to be Angel of Mischief. Although Slacker can stay on the field herself pretty effectively, unless attacking has some form of advantage for you, it's not necessary to go into Downerd Magician right away. Then if Ceasefire or Goblin King is not immediately available, you just sit on either Slacker / Downerd or Angel of Mischief in defense mode due to their high defense, and stall until you get one of the above cards, for your opponent will only have 1 monster to play with thanks to the other Dustons, barring a field clearing effect like Dark Hole. This deck can be annoyingly slow to finish at times because of this waiting, but it is necessary to maximize victory probability because you're not always going to have that Goblin King or Ceasefire to ride to victory on the turn you hit the combo. In the end, the Duston deck is rather interesting because its ability to screw up the opponent's field is actually more consistent than most people realize, as long as you're willing to sacrifice some life points to accomplish that task. Well, that's my Duston deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.